Right, I'm a bit pissed. AI-generated poetry is indistinguishable from human-written poetry and is rated more favorably. That's what these authors claim in the title. Now, if you actually read the paper, you go through the methodology, you even read the abstract, you're going to realize that this title is not only incredibly misleading, I believe it's straight up lying to its audience. Let me explain why. If you're going to make the claim that AI-generated poetry is indistinguishable from human-written poetry, the first thing you might want to do is get experts who actually know what they're talking about to read the poems. But that's not what they do. If you read through this paper, you realize that actually they just polled a whole bunch of people off the street who maybe have never read a poem in their life. In fact, that's exactly what the respondents say. Of the 1,700 participants they have in the study, only 5 of them, 0.3%, actually read poetry every day. 2.1% read it every day, 7.9% read it every month, with the majority of them reading it a few times per year or less, and I would say about a third of them never reading poetry at all. That, at least in my opinion, is pretty damning, especially when we're trying to prove that AI poetry is indistinguishable from human-written poetry. Now, you could argue that it's only indistinguishable in the eyes of people who have never read poetry, but then what's the point of this paper? These people didn't care about poetry before, and they're not going to care about poetry now. Going back to the paper, they actually had AI generate poetry in the flavor of a bunch of very famous poets. Walt Whitman, Lord Byron, Samuel Butler, etc. So let's go ahead and look at these AI-generated poems, because even here, it doesn't pass the sniff test. Let's first take a look at Walt Whitman. I hear the call of nature, the rustling of the trees, the whisper of the river, the buzzing of the bees, the chirping of the songbirds and the howling of the wind, all woven into a symphony that never seems to end. Now, that was the AI-generated poetry, and I'll be honest, it's pretty good. But remember, it doesn't have to be pretty good, it has to be indistinguishable from the real Walt Whitman. So let's take a look at the real Walt Whitman. The one who wrote Leaves of Grass, which might be his most famous work. I celebrate myself, and what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. See, Walt Whitman was a very famous poet, right? Famous for a number of different ways, but in particular, he was famous for free verse. He was famous for creating poems that did not sound like poems, pushing the boundary of what we can do in the field. Right? And in that way, this AI-generated Walt Whitman will create poems that might sound good or sound a little bit naturey, but they're not going to be Walt Whitman. They're not indistinguishable, right? Now let's take a look at Lord Byron. I can't read this, give me a second. She walks the earth with grace and pride, a beauty that cannot be denied, with eyes that shine like stars above, and lips that speak of endless love. Okay, that's the AI-generated version. So now let's look at the real Lord Byron, with one of my favorite poems from him, Don Juan. There's actually a huge history behind this poem, but I'm just going to read this particular snippet. I could talk more about it, but I don't want to. I want a hero, an uncommon want, when every year a month sends forth a new one. Till, after cloying the gazettes with cant, the age discovers he's not the true one. Now, here's the thing about Don Juan and Lord Byron. He's old, super old. So old, in fact, that the English that he uses is not archaic, but it is of a different era, and you can tell that by reading Lord Byron's poetry. This AI does not sound like Lord Byron at all. You can just read one after the other and you know that they are clearly different authors. Now let's look at Shakespeare. Now, I don't know if this is just a supplementary material I got, but they picked an absolutely absurd passage to put in for Shakespeare. Thy bosom is endeared with all hearts, which I by lacking have supposed dead. And there reigns love and all love's loving parts, and all those friends which I thought buried. Okay. The reason this is weird is because even though I believe it is written by Shakespeare, it doesn't follow the typical pentameter and rhyme that I'm used to from Shakespeare. I mean, it does, but it also just subtly is off. It's not one of his best writings, right? And I understand why you might do that, right? Because Shakespeare is such a well-known poet that you might not want to put in his most famous poems here. However, when the poem you put down for Shakespeare doesn't follow the most well-known trait for Shakespeare in his writings, I mean, it does, but just it's kind of subtly off. I mean, there's a reason people might not think this is the real Shakespeare. They might think it's someone else, right? Especially when most of these respondents basically don't read poetry, right? Now, I'm going to put my tinfoil hat here on for just a second. See, if we look at this figure right over here, we see we have AI in blue and human in red, and the overall quality in this bar in blue right here. And basically, they're trying to make the claim that AI tends to produce poems that people like better on average. And certainly this figure seems to indicate that, but I don't know. I feel like maybe they had data that they didn't decide to publish. And the reason I'm maybe kind of pointing to this, and again, I'm not officially saying this is true, but I'm saying that it could possibly be true, is because if we look at this divot here, where Chaucer, Shakespeare, Emily Dickinson, where all these authors are, we see that the orange bar here for human is always underneath this divot, right? Whereas the blue bar is always above the divot. That is to say, In an ideal world, they wouldn't just have Allen Ginsberg here, they would have Allen Ginsberg versus the AI counterpart in orange of Allen Ginsberg. You see what I'm saying? I feel like, in principle, or in practice, maybe they actually had more data, or they wanted more data in the study, and they did not publish that. Because in my mind, you cannot make the claim that these two authors are indistinguishable if you do actually see a very clear difference between the AI and human ratings, right? And it could be that maybe the AI rating was rated more favorably. Like I said, some of these authors, like for example, Lord Byron, come from a different time when we wanted different things out of poetry. So it totally makes sense that people would like something with a better rhyme scheme or meter than something that Lord Byron is typically putting out, though he was actually known for meter and rhyme, but you know what I'm trying to say. So now let me take a look at Sylvia Plath. Now her poetry is known for being just kind of completely free, something that speaks to your heart and doesn't follow the modern conventions of rhyme or meter or anything like that. So, the air is thick with tension, my mind a tangled mess. The weights of my emotion is heavy on my chest. That does not sound like a Sylvia Plath poem. Now, maybe I just haven't read the right Sylvia Plath poems. Maybe this AI was reading specifically from one piece of poetry, and then somehow like it took that and it said, this is just how Sylvia Plath writes. But I don't think that's true. What I believe is actually happening here is that AI is actually pretty good at creating meter and creating rhyme because it's, some sort of structure that AI can hold on to. So when you ask it to generate a poem, it tries to generate a poem that kind of looks like something it would expect a poem to look like, again, with meter and rhyme. Then it adds flair to that poetry in such a way that it kind of speaks to similar motifs, right? So Walt Whitman's AI was very much not Walt Whitman, but it had similar ideas as Walt Whitman might have talked about, right? It's talking about nature, it's talking about bees, it's talking about trees, it's talking about things that Walt Whitman loves to talk about, but without the core reason as to why we still study Walt Whitman today. With this in mind, knowing that AI is going to generate what is essentially poetic slop, it might have been better to directly compare the AI poetic slop to authors that people actually know about, like Edgar Allan Poe or Dr. Seuss even, people who have a known meter and rhyme scheme. And then we could compare those who have good meter and rhyme to AI, which will generate meter and rhyme anyway, and then we could actually have a good apples to apples comparison. But that's not what this paper did. This paper literally took a bunch of data and said, oh, hey, look at this. People don't understand poetry. Here's something that AI can do better than humans because humans don't even know what they're looking for when it comes to poetry. So let me put it to you this way. The way I see poetry is a boundary-pushing medium, right? It's not something that everybody likes, and it's not something that I believe everybody should like. When you read a poem, you are sitting there trying to dissect the meaning of every single word. It's not very much unlike a scientific report. You spend time with poems thinking about what the author is trying to represent. AI fundamentally cannot do that. That's not what AI is for. It is not boundary pushing. It'll create slop, right? That's what AI does. It will create slop. And that slop will look something like a poem for people who don't know poetry, right? And if you don't know poetry, of course the AI slop is going to sound better than poets who are not writing in traditional schemes that you're used to poetry sounding like. And so when you put this all together, this paper has become one of my least liked papers I've ever read. I get so pissed off every time I think about it because this title is so incredibly off what the results actually show and the data actually show that they provide in the supplementary material. It's just lying to you. They are literally just lying to you. And it pisses me off so much that the majority of this AI junk is just people lying to you. So, okay, now take a step back. It is true that in the abstract they do qualify this, right? They say we are using non-experts. They also say that the simplicity of AI-generated poems may be easier for non-experts to understand, leading them to prefer AI-generated poetry and misinterpret the complexity of human poems as incoherence generated by AI. That's fine. That's fine to qualify in the abstract. I get why you want to do that, because otherwise it's incredibly misleading. But the fact is, you really should have put by non-experts right here in the title, because without that by non-experts qualifier, this paper is genuinely flawed. And I can guarantee you that of these 96 people who are citing your paper, most of them probably did not read past that headline. Right? And that's why I'm so incredibly pissed off about this paper, right? It is misleading, it's misrepresenting the findings, and even though it qualifies it in the text, that's not okay. Look, I have so much more I want to talk about, but I think this is it for now. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.